our session, which is a book launch for the book titled Globalisation, Governance and Growth by Ishrat Husain. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. The moderator for this session is Waqar Ahmed, in conversation with Syed Salim Raza and Ishrat Husain. Dr. Waqar Ahmed is Deputy Executive Director at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. He is a former advisor to UNDP and has undertaken assignments with the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Ministries of Finance, Planning and Commerce in Pakistan. He has published extensively in areas such as macroeconomic modeling, inclusive and sustainable growth reforms, trade and taxation policies, regional trade agreements, trade in services, energy governance, and border-related trade infrastructure. Waqar.
Thank you very much for this gracious introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this book launch today. Yes. Am I audible now, Ji? Yes. Yes. So again, if I can welcome everyone to this book launch. We have this book by Dr. Ishrat Husain, Globalisation, Governance and Growth, which is a compilation of his work done during the past few years on these subjects. While my introduction has been done, I must do a bit more justice by introducing my fellow panelists today. So let me start by introducing Dr. Ishrat Husain, whose book is being launched today. As most of you know, he's Dean and Director of IBA Karachi. He was also Chairman, National Commission for Government Reforms, former Governor of State Bank of Pakistan, and has a very long-ranging career with the World Bank. I also have the honor of introducing Syed Salim Raza Sahab, who's an eminent economist and banker. He was also the CEO of Pakistan Business Council, former Governor of State Bank of Pakistan, and currently an adjunct faculty member with IBA Karachi, and also serving on the boards of several private sector entities. Now, given that we only have a little less than an hour now, of course, so the way I was thinking of taking it was that maybe if I'll request Dr. Ishrat Husain for some initial remarks on his book, of course. I have some questions which I can pose right at the outset so that there's no interruption in between. And maybe if he can take around 7 to 10 minutes maybe, or a little under that, we could move to Salim Raza Saab, who I understand has a PowerPoint. And that if that can also take maybe 8 to 10 minutes, we can then move straight
9 to 11.
9 to 11. And then perhaps we can engage our esteemed audience today. So with this, you know, so before I move to Dr. Ishrat Husain, I thought, while I don't want to give away anything from the book, I thought there were a couple of things, Dr. Saab, that where Pakistan stands today, while there are a lot of mega trends in our political economy and game changes that we see every day, but you do talk about the 6 drivers of globalization. And the natural question that comes to mind is, how prepared are we to embrace those 6 drivers of globalization which you have pointed out in your book? You also point out that trade remains an important pillar of economic growth, and that openness, no country has grown without sort of opening up its borders for trade, movement of people across the border. But still, over here again, the question arises that have we missed the bandwagon of regional integration, so to say? So as I see today, with BIMSTEC and BBIN connectivity agreements in South Asia, there's a minus Pakistan SARC which is moving ahead actually. I would also like your interventions on that. The new trend that we're also seeing in Central and South Asia, if I can say, is that the countries are increasingly becoming part of what we call value chains. Are we prepared to sort of move on to that stage? And then perhaps, of course, you may have any other interventions or highlights from the book that you would like to point out. Sir, it's over to you, please.
Thank you, Waqar. I'm delighted to be here this morning to make a brief presentation on the main findings of the book, which is available here. Before answering your specific questions, let me submit that globalization is inevitable. Whether we want to opt out of it, as a lot of people do argue, is a prior question. Except North Korea, which is the only country in the world, after Myanmar and Cuba, both have now decided to integrate themselves as a part of the global community. North Korea is the only country in the world, after 200 countries, which is trying to resist the forces of globalization. The question for us in Pakistan is whether there are people who come on your talk shows, who write in the newspapers that Pakistan should be inward-looking, insular, completely isolated from the rest of the world. And we should be self-reliant and self-sufficient, nothing to do with the rest of the world. And that thinking is becoming quite common. So first we have to establish whether this is the path we want to take in the future and what its consequences are. Its consequences are that the young, middle class, educated, which has got aspirations for getting ahead in their lives, would have a frustrating life, and they will walk with their feet and leave this country, depriving us of the skills, of the capital which we need in order to develop and reduce the poverty. Those consequences should be kept in mind. If we don't want to take that path, then we have to decide how to manage globalization. Because globalization has both the positive points as well as the negative points. The negative points is that the pace of information explosion, the technological advancements, the skill intensity of output, these are becoming quite fierce. And if we are not able to capture those and manage those impulses, we would be left behind. On the other hand, the four pillars of globalization are trade, technology, capital, and migration and the remittances. To answer your question, at this moment, the only positive aspect of globalization, which is being internalized by us in Pakistan, is the migration and the workers' remittances. But there also, we have a disconnect. Most of the migrants are unskilled labor, while the majority of our younger population is coming out of the universities and colleges, and they are not skilled and they are not employable. The vocational and technical training in this country is only 1%. The tertiary education or the higher education is between 7 to 10%, but mostly in subjects which are not relevant either to the Pakistan economy or to the outside. On trade, we were ahead of Bangladesh. In 2003, Bangladesh had garment exports of 3 billion, and so did we. Today, Bangladesh's exports of garments are 25 billion plus, and we are still struggling with 3 billion garments. So you can see what is happening to our participation in trade. We are the only country in South Asia where the share of Pakistani exports is actually declining, while both India and Bangladesh are actually increasing their market share in this globalized trade. On technology, we are quite fortunate that we have the mobile phone penetration, which is almost 60-65%, and now we have 3G and 4G, so we are getting 25 million internet connections. But this technology has not been used in order to enhance our education, health services, agriculture, and other services which can benefit the people living in the far off and the remote areas of Pakistan. So technology is getting penetrated through the ICT, but outside ICT, we do not have much of technology advancement in this country. And the fourth is the capital, and capital is the official capital or the private capital. During the first 6 years or 7 years, we were able to attract very large amounts of the private capital. In 2007, we had reached $5 billion of foreign direct investment from the private sector, and our 30-year bond was oversubscribed in the US market, and its pricing was very close to Turkey, which is investment grade. But today, we do not have the same kind of pricing or the penetration of the foreign direct investment. So these are the 4 areas through which we can derive benefits for the economy. People say, why should we care about the world trade? The entire domestic product or incomes of all Pakistanis is only 250 billion. If you increase or you capture 1% of the market share in the world trade, you will be able to get $30 billion of additional income. China has 1.2 billion people. India has got 1.2 billion people. But if you look at China's growth, it is not coming up from the domestic market, which is quite large, but because it has become the largest exporting nation in the world. So the relationship between growth and exports through the globalization. My final point is that governance is the intermediary between globalization and growth. If your institutions of governance are strong and sound, then the transmission from globalization towards high growth takes place much easily. But if your institutions are dysfunctional, it's just like a pipe. You have the water flowing from here, and you are the user on the other end of the water. If the pipe, and the pipe is the governance, if the pipe is clogged, or it is leaking, or it is got crust about it, then the water flowing on the other end is going to be in trickle, or it's going to be not available at all. So unless you try to strengthen your governance institutions, whether executive, parliament, educational institutions, private sector, judiciary, you will not be able to get the maximum benefits out of globalization. So that's the theme of this book, that we have to concentrate on increasing the strength and the soundness of Pakistan's institutions. Let's stop the blame game. Let us stop saying, oh, the military is doing this and the civilians are doing this, political leaders are doing this, the businessmen are doing this. We will have a lose-lose game. But if we try to work together, like Japan incorporated or Korea incorporated, where the government and the private sector and every other institution work together, this is a win-win situation, and you will be able to derive the maximum benefit from the globalization. So that's the theme of this book, and this is the argument which I wanted to bring forth in the public knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I think one of the key aspects that you discuss in the book, that's about retooling the institutions in Pakistan, and a large part of that work also comes when you were heading the National Commission for Government Reforms. Of course, while we are moving onwards to Mr. Salim Raza's presentation, but when we come back to you probably, one of the things that you could highlight, and of course it's there in the book as well, was your experience with the civil service reforms. Now, as we move forward, we understand that whatever reform implementation that we have proposed in the Vision 2025 or the provincial plans or growth strategies that we have, the primary instrument of implementing those reforms is the civil service. So probably we will like to hear more about that when we come back to you. With this, we move to the presentation by Mr. Salim Raza, and of course, while we hand over to him, one of the drivers, Salim Sahab, that Dr. Ishrat's book highlights is, of course, the financial integration. And this is where, of course, we would like to learn from your experience as well, how Pakistan has progressed. Now, while the banking industry is, banking and finance industry is sort of highlighted as a success, or a successful reform story in Pakistan, we do, however, see people, or especially our business community, complaining about the lack of financial integration in the region, so to say. So you don't find Pakistan's financial representativeness, if I can say, or Pakistani banks, to put it in more simplistic terms, in the region. So the trader community, or even those who want to take their foreign direct investment to those countries like Afghanistan, Central Asia, we don't even have banks in Iran, for example, or very minimal representation of our banks in Iran. No banks in India, for example, a country with, we do have around $2 billion of trade with India. Mm-hmm. So perhaps if you could touch upon this issue or aspect of globalization as well, please, sir.
All right. So is this functioning? Okay. If you can put my presentation. Dr. Ishrat's book is a tour de force and covers, a huge Pakistan in the context of globalization and the governance issues of Pakistan. Very succinctly identifies how globalization can be facing headwinds in globalization. There are uncertainties, as he points out in his book, and he has a lot of recommendations on how developed and developing countries can work together to, stabilize, what are challenges we see today, and also how the multilaterals can readapt their role to further globalization and, again, smoothen some of the obstacles we see at present. I'm just going to pick up on one theme, actually, which is the challenges that globalization in its entirety faces today. Pakistan's lack of integration with the huge wave of globalization we've seen over the last 30 years, and how Pakistan might better adapt in the changing framework of globalization over the next decade. So,
Next.
all right. So this is basically the summary of what I'm going to do in 9 to 11 minutes. Global growth is slowing significantly, and there are various risks to its. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can see the. Maybe you can put it up there. And there are various risks actually to its early reversal. It's unlikely to reverse in the near future. What there is no doubt about is that this ongoing balancing of production and demography favors growth shifting from the mature economies towards the newer economies, and perhaps we're going to see more regionalization of trade and aid blocks, new regional development institutions, additional reserve assets, the RMB, the Chinese currency, possibly a readaptation of the SDR to be like a reserve asset, not just an accounting mechanism, and the emergence of new financial centers. Singapore could be very important in the next 10 years, not as an alternative, but as a supplement to New York and London. So we'll see readaptation of globalization. Now the Pakistani economy, as I said, has been largely bypassed so far by globalization, and we could be much more significant, but we'll need strong institutional reform, on which Ishrat Saab's book is really a Bible. I think anyone pursuing this subject, could use that as a blueprint. All right. So what are we looking at today? Starting with the financial crash, and then, compounded further by the reduction in China's growth over the last 2-3 years. There are economic consequences and social and political consequences globally. Globally, GDP has fallen to half, from 5.5 to 2.5. Trade growth has fallen to a third, from about 12%, this is in the last 8 or 9 years, from 12% to 4%. Global capital inflows into emerging markets have slowed from 15% of global GDP to 3%. And last year saw a net outflow from emerging markets for the first time of about $750 billion. Much of it was from China, but it's the first net outflow. There's been a sharp, because of China's reduced purchasing, or the slowdown in the rate of increase of China's purchasing, there's been a sharp fall in metal, mineral, commodity prices globally, which has hurt primary producers around the world. Major emerging markets, for different macroeconomic reasons and political reasons, have been downgraded. Brazil, Turkey, Russia, they are not investment grade anymore. South Africa is on the fringe with a negative outlook. The global banks, the big giants of the financial flows that underwrote the globalization of the last 3 decades, are tethered. They're being re-regulated. They're consolidating themselves, pulling in their horns, repatriating capital. And their investment banking capacity has been curtailed, actually, by the regulators. And to some extent, banks are being more modest with respect to their adventurism in the past on the investment banking front. The lack of an alternative for a reserve asset to the dollar is something of a straitjacket, because 2/3 of global central bank reserves are kept with the dollar. So whatever happens to the dollar affects the balance sheets of all central banks, has ripples right through, and so that's seen as limiting. And for the Eurozone countries, the lack of their capacity to conduct any kind of monetary policy because of the euro, because of their they cannot create their own currency. That's all up to the European Central Bank. So that's seen as something of a straitjacket. Next. What we have now is an emerging framework of secular stagnation, global savings glut, more savings than investment, inadequate demand against the huge surpluses of Europe, which is principally Germany and China, and demand stagnation. These countries in the major economic blocs, the US, Eurozone, UK, Japan, have had an inflation target of 2% for the last several years, but inflation it just isn't there. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, for America grew just about 1% last year, and for the Eurozone, Japan and the UK, it was between 0.5% and nil, and some months were actually deflationary. Prices fell. There are negative interest rates in the Eurozone, Japan, Switzerland, Sweden already. Sweden's negative interest rates are 1%. So if banks put money with the central bank, they get charged 1%. This is all to try to induce people to spend, to increase consumption. But so far it hasn't worked. How far do negative interest rates have to go? There'll be a point, another percent will become ridiculous. Really means that if you don't buy something now, your money, you better buy something now because your money will be worth less in the future. But so far, no particular dynamism through this methodology, through trying to induce expenditure or consumption. PIMCO is the world's largest fixed income manager. They manage about $2 trillion in assets. They're quite pessimistic about the chances of a reversal of these trends. And I've listed a set of factors there that they point out to. Another phenomena is assetless enterprises. Again, that means to that extent, investment will be forestalled. Uber is the world's largest taxi company, doesn't own a taxi. Amazon is the world's biggest supermarket, doesn't own any bricks and mortar, etc. Facebook is the world's largest media company, but doesn't have any premises. Airbnb books more hotel rooms than any chain in the world and doesn't own a hotel. So you've heard of all these entities. And there's more and more, through technology, more and more a trend towards this kind of business enterprise, which is very good for the consumer, but on the investment side, doesn't cause any expenditure, doesn't build bricks and mortar, doesn't create jobs. Economists offer widely differing solutions. And, I'm not going to go through them, but there's Ben Bernanke talking about global policy coordination, which is a polite way of saying that China and Germany better get their focus turned to internal consumption and stop sucking savings in from the rest of the world through their massive export engines. Rogoff, another economist, says that while the debt overhang exists in the world, there will be no growth, but that's fine. You can say that. How on earth do you bring out debt in something that looks deflationary already? Krugman says unabashed Keynesianism, and Larry Summers actually goes back to Roosevelt, to the steps that Roosevelt took to get America out of the Great Depression, which is infrastructure spending. And this debate goes on. You see it in all the financial press in the world. The point is, all these things are right, but who's the leader and how is the strategy going to crystallize? There are social-political concerns. Inequality has reduced between countries. That globalization has done. China's per capita is now, a percentage of America's, whereas it was negligible and, rounded off to nothing, 30 years ago. So between countries, inequality is reduced. Within countries, less today in Europe than it was in 2008. Still, UK and Europe operate austerity fiscal policies, which means they're cutting down welfare state benefits. They are trying to run very narrow fiscal deficits. And this, of course, does nothing to increase consumption. Another reaction of all this is, the corollary of all this is political hardening in Europe and America along, the left and right, the centrist, the centrist position seems to be sort of melting away, at least at the popular level, to the right and to the left. Anti-migrant pressures, a desire to recapture sovereignty, this Brexit, Britain's going to have a referendum on whether they're going to be part of the European Union. They will be part of the European market. This is about whether they stay in the European Union and subordinate themselves to supranational laws. Brexit, this is the Greece exit. So British exit, Greece exit. Brexit can happen any time because whenever there's a loan installment due, Greece can't make it. So, this threat of cracking fissures in the Eurozone is there. And all along, everywhere, there's a lot of frustration with how business can influence politics. One example is multinational corporations. They've done, an absolute terrific job in creating global supply chains, and that's the biggest, most significant way in which the emerging markets have benefited from global growth. But they are stateless, they are supranational, and their sole objective is shareholder value, which is fine until you hit the national interest of large blocks of people. So this corporate tax inversion, most of these the FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, Starbucks, also General Electric, also a lot of pharmaceutical companies, have structured their international operations in such a way that they end up, they're using low tax or no tax jurisdictions in such combinations that they end up paying less than 5%. Starbucks in the last 14 of the 15 years of operating in England has shown losses for the last 14 years, and they've been expanding. They're now 1/3 of the market. But there's no need for them to pay tax because of the availability of these jurisdictions. And what that means is someone has to pay tax. So to the extent that the corporations are not, the major corporations with huge sales in these countries, then the burden passes, then the government has to pick it up from the consumer, from the individual. So, there's resentment that individuals will have to pick up the tax burden that the corporates have been able to dodge. Then also, multinationals have such huge, particularly the media companies have such colossal dominance, and their span of protected payments is so broad that a lot of local businesses at the nation-state level in Europe see a glass ceiling. They can't rise above. They're also at a competitive disadvantage because they pay 25% tax and their competitors, the multinationals, pay virtually nothing. So this again, both these factors are going to affect the freedom of multinationals to operate as they will. In other words, tether them a little more to the nation state. I've got 2 minutes left. Now this is just an aside. Low labor cost emerging markets in the context of globalization are looking at some risks. Nearshoring, you remember the offshoring is when all the jobs went out. Now, the trend is reversing in small ways. Nearshoring is, Europe now looking at Eastern Europe for its back office, not India, because Eastern Europe is a day's flight, and the laws and language are sort of, closer together. USA is looking more at Mexico and Central America. So that's nearshoring. Reshoring is bringing jobs back home. And here robotics, 3D printers, etc. are going to have a role in the coming years. So how will all this reshape globalization? I think 2 things are clear. The global West, the mature economies can no longer solely define global rules. It's opened out. There are now, we're not multi-regional in terms of economic blocks yet, but that's the direction. And the second is market supranational governance institutions and supranational businesses can no longer override the legitimacy extended to them by nation states. In other words, I've mentioned to you some of the frustrations of the nation state with globalization. I think those frustrations will have to be respected much more, which will there's going to be no repudiation of globalization, but there's going to be a reappraisal, and one outcome, and this is just speculative on my part, is closer and more regional economic groupings, institutions and trading blocks. So China, for example, the 3 major initiatives it has these days, One Belt, One Road, which Pakistan is part of, the regional cooperation for economic partnership, which includes the ASEAN countries in Asia plus 4 or 5 others, then the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, a colossal entity to rival the World Bank. The US is building up as a counter the Transatlantic Partnership, which is the US and the Eurozone, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the US and about 11 countries on the Pacific Rim. This business of additional reserve currency is now important. China, the RMB now has a 10% weightage in the SDR, which is significant. This additional reserve currency will have to emerge. The good news on the ructions that capital flows, the hot money, which is now from the West going back to America because of the likelihood of the increase in interest rates in the dollar. The IMF has now accepted selective capital controls on the part of developing countries to protect them from these hot money outflows. Our stock markets affected them by them as well. What will carry on and what is not going to change, and that's the most positive contribution of globalization, is the global supply chains. They are going to carry on, and they will assume more power. So under the perhaps less global, more regional arrangements, the global supply chain will remain intact. Now, how has Pakistan done with respect to the globalization that the world has seen up to now? It's not on the map. So these are figures, data from the WTO. Share of foreign sector integration in exports, and that means how much do you import that you re-export. That is the supply chain. Boeing's parts are made in 14 different countries. This iPod is manufactured in 5 different countries. So you reallocate work according to cost and skills. So here, Korea, 42% of the exports are part of the value chain, global supply chains, Malaysia 41, world average is 24, and I couldn't find Pakistan on it, which means we must have been a very negligible figure. The table doesn't feature Pakistan because it doesn't mention countries below 10%. Here, this is our core export, textiles. Now, as Dr. Ishrat said, Bangladesh, and if we say this is because of law and order, the buyers don't come here, the brands don't want to operate here, well, this is not something that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years. This has always been the trend. We've always gone for the lower value added, it's easier, it's cheaper, it needs less marketing, it needs less value development, so we're all right in textiles, which is, bed linen, garments, home textiles, but in clothing, which is the higher value added end, where your human labor, your human cost makes the difference, we are absolutely nowhere. Bangladesh doesn't grow cotton, nor does Vietnam, nor does Thailand, nor does Malaysia. And we do, but we ought to be competing with Turkey and India, and unfortunately, we're not there. Agri exports, food exports, agriculture and food exports. The growth here comes from research, BT seeds, genetically modified seeds, corporate farming. There again, monster countries like Brazil. India is right up there. Vietnam, and Vietnam, in 2000, our exports were about 6-7 billion. Vietnam's were about 8 to 9 billion. Today, Vietnam's exports are about 170 billion. We're at 25 billion. And Vietnam is right across. It's the exports are very well distributed. So here again, our potential is far, far greater than our achievement. Manufacturing, this is components. Again, I'm looking at the supply chain. Components in international supply chains, automotive, telecom, integrated circuits and electronics, data processing and office equipment. China is huge, but India, 52 billion in data processing plus services, another 50 billion. Thailand, one of the biggest countries for auto spare parts, integrated circuits, and even Vietnam, has come along in the last several years. But again, our achievement was not big enough to get on the map. So, just to finish, we've lagged behind much of Asia. The issue is very simple. It's the determination of our business and, then supported by government to preserve our domestic market for often uncompetitive industry. Exports have not really come into our culture in any way. If you look at where the major investments gone from the Pakistani private sector over the last decade, it's all internally focused. Power investment that we talk so much about, it's actually riskless. You're not investing in power, you're buying a government bond because the government guarantees all payments. Telecoms have achieved a lot in Pakistan, but it's mainly foreign companies. Anyway, I'll stop there because I think this is where Dr. Ishrat's expertise in what's wrong and what we need to do with governance is extremely relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim Saab. This was really insightful and a very comprehensive presentation. And I thought that your presentation did dovetail a lot with what Dr. Ishrat had talked about on trade and skills gap, actually. You also, a couple of weeks back, had given a presentation at Pakistan Business Council on Pakistan's gaps or capabilities gaps, if I can say, in project financing, and how when we talk about, and you also just said, the One Belt, One Road initiative of China, and of course, now that we are part of it in terms of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, what is our level of preparedness to pick up on this opportunity, basically. But while I'll leave that question with you, given the paucity of time, let me now move to our esteemed audience, and we could pick up a couple of comments, questions, observations. So maybe if I can pick up 3 or 4 responses and then come back to the panel. Mike, please. Gentleman in front.
Can you hear me? Dr. Ishrat, thank you very much for your
If you
presentation.
could introduce yourself, please.
Just a quick question. What do you see as the impact of globalization on income inequality? If you look at the case of China, the Gini coefficient seems to be going in the wrong direction. In other words, the Gini coefficient is increasing. You look at South Africa, you look at Brazil. So what do you see as the issue coming out of this globalization? Thank you.
I think China is an exceptional case. Brazil, for example, has reversed. When I was a graduate student, we used to have this fish law article on Brazil's inequality. After the new government of Lula and the Bolsa Familia, which is a cash transfer to the poor, the income inequalities in Brazil has actually gone down. So what we have learned today is that growth per se is not going to help the inequality. It does help poverty reduction because China has been able to bring 500 million people above the poverty line, which is an unprecedented feat during 25 years. But it has contributed to 52 billionaires in China also. So what you require is social safety nets and social transfers. And Oportunidad in Mexico and Bolsa Familia in Brazil and the Benazir Income Support Program in Pakistan are the instruments through which you can actually help growth along with reduction in inequality. But growth will increase inequality unless you bring in poverty-targeted interventions and progressive taxation and skill formation for the poor. And that is what these programs achieve.
Thank you. Yawar Ali Saab.
Thank you, Dr. Ishrat and Salim Raza. My question is actually to the panel. And the question is the impact of the lower oil prices on the emerging markets and the developed markets.
Well, you have a differentiated
Dr.
impact.
Dr. Can we pick two more responses?
I think, well, let us do this and then after that you can collect a few.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a differentiated impact. Nigeria, Venezuela, Algeria, Mexico are in trouble because of the oil prices. Even Saudi Arabia had a 15% GDP deficit this year, and they've drawn down $100 billion of their reserves. But countries like India, Pakistan, who are oil importers and commodity users, have actually benefited from this. What happens to the global economy is not a first order reaction, but the second order, as to what do we do with the savings which has been created. In Pakistan, we are using these savings to bring down our current account deficit and the fiscal deficit, but the investment is not going up. If you use the savings in order to boost up the investment, you will have higher growth and poverty reduction. So it depends on what the policy response is. And every country has a different policy response. India has used it in order to have a larger investment, which is fueling the economy. It's now 7.5% growth rate in India. So each country is impacted differentially, but also the policy response of the country is going to determine whether this is going to benefit them or it is going to hurt them.
On this side, Arif Saab, second row.
Arif Zaman, I work with the Commonwealth on the economic side. I think just, Dr. Ishrat, it is a book of national significance, but probably I would say international significance in the way that you've painted the landscape. But I think there are three aspects, just to put this question back to you. I think income disparities is really a very big issue in terms of, you talk about demographics, but income disparities, particularly impact on youth unemployment, is a big issue, not just in Pakistan, but a number of developing countries. And we see the unintended consequences of what can happen if that goes unchecked. But also, I want to say something about women. Women's education, employment, and empowerment, it's really quite appalling. 46%, I think, under successive governments in Pakistan, it is still really very low in terms of literacy, and no economy, as you know, will ever grow unless you're tapping into that. The third area is export markets. We still in Pakistan and many emerging markets, we focus on those traditional markets. Markets, as you know, in Africa and elsewhere are growing. Commonwealth markets, 19%
if I
there.
could
So there's a big
request you to
opportunity
ask
there
the
as well.
question, please.
Yeah,
Yes.
so those trends, what's the significance of those trends in
Yes.
your analysis? Thank you.
So we have a response from the back, very back. Yes, please.
Yeah, my question is, how does Pakistan ever begin to address the huge problem faced with a large, uneducated, unskilled population? Population growth is projected to be 300 billion by 2030. Severe energy crisis, severe environmental degradation, and water crisis as well.
Ji, front pe.
Shahnaz want.
Zafar Khan is my name. So my question, Dr. Saab, to you is, over the years we've said so much about governance, and there's been so much work done through committees such as yourself, but unfortunately we don't see much traction on the ground. So the question really is, how do we get our decision makers? They never come to such forums. How do we get our decision makers to hear the good recommendations that have come through these task forces and to actually see a difference happen?
Ji, yahan pe ji, front.
I'm Hassan from Investment and Marketing. Of the four factors, trade, technology, migration, and remittance, Dr. Ishrat said it. I just pick up only one, that is migration. At the moment, there is a big issue of restricting migration from one country to another. The problem is increasing every day. Now, if this factor continues like this, how do you foresee coming 5 to 10 years in terms of migration creating any impact on globalization?
Okay, let me come back to the panel for a while, starting from Dr. Ishrat, please. Doctor,
Okay.
we can take
There
it.
was a question by Shahnaz Wazir Ali, so I wanted
Ji, please.
The question is very specific, actually, it's to both the panelists. This is with regard to reducing income inequality in Pakistan and the income transfer program or the cash transfer programs being the right prescription, which I do think they are. But why is it is taking us so long to connect them with social outcomes and making them into conditional cash transfers? Conditional, in other words, enroll your child in school and you'll get the cash transfer, have fewer children and you'll get the cash transfer, get an attended childbirth and you'll get a cash transfer. So what are the issues around this in Pakistan? Because we know the social returns, they're very clear, but we've not been able to structure these programs for conditional cash transfers. And can government really sustain the amount that will be required to fund this for at least a decade on a larger scale?
Ji, please. Doctor, would you like to maybe take these responses?
All right. Let me start with this nexus between population growth, education, energy, shortages, environmental. They're all interrelated. If you have a younger population, and Pakistan is very fortunate that you have a demographic dividend in the sense that while the rest of the world has aging population, we have very youthful population. 60% of our population is going to be the youthful population. If you equip them with the skill sets which are needed by the rest of the world, you will not only solve the problem of unemployment in the country, but also become the supplier of labor to the rest of the world. So that's why I very much emphasize that instead of producing BAs and MAs who do not have any skill set, we should have a change in our own social thinking. We should have more paramedicals, we should have more plumbers, we should have more electricians, we should have more masons, welders, HVAC operators. There are huge skill gaps, not only in Pakistan but outside. But we do not. We want our child, whether he or she is really capable, to go to a college or university and get a degree of BA and MBA. So unless we change our own mindset as a society and give value to manual labor, I don't think we are going to achieve very much. So it's a mindset change. And if you do that, then you are able to increase the incomes, invest in energy shortages, take care of environment. So these are all interrelated. The first question on governance issues, I think you are just observing how politically difficult it is to introduce governance reforms. You have been the head of PIA and you know that organization in and out. The government is trying to bring in a strategic investor who can manage this organization on a professional basis. After all, Emirates is being run by the Britishers, not by Emiratis, right? And they are making huge money. Look at the response, not only of the employees, but of the media. On the one hand, the media says, oh, the government is not doing any reforms. And when the government comes in and tries to stick to that and doesn't, yield back, there is a backlash against that. And the opposition is also scoring points. So this is a national issue. We don't make it as a partisan issue. Governance is not a short-term phenomena, it is a long-term phenomena. So when all political parties do converge and do agree and do have a consensus, then alone we can have a governance reforms. One government for 5 years cannot do this. Coming to Shehnaz's question, I think we are too late in introducing both the unconditional cash transfers and conditional transfers. Well, we are fortunate that we had this poverty scorecard. We have the Nadra NIC cards. We have the women identified as the beneficiary of these. This combination actually is very useful in order to reach out to the poor. Until your government decided to carry out this survey, we didn't know where the poor lived. So for the first time in last 5 years, we know where the poor live and we are able to reach out and the leakages are very low. Even in Bolsa Familia and in Mexico, it took 10 to 15 years before you can see the results. So the results of what your government did in 2008, 2009 will not be apparent till 2020 or so. But the conditional cash transfer is the way to bring the girls back into the school, and that's what the BISP is doing. On the question of migration, Hassan Saab, the migration has become now a political issue in the US as well as in Europe. And as Salim pointed out, we have resistance by the rightist parties. They don't want the Moroccans and the Algerians and the Syrians and the Iraqis to come and dilute the cultural fabric of their countries. Why Donald Trump is so much ahead of everybody else in the polls? Because he's empathizing with the inherent wishes of the white people who think they are going to become minority by the Mexicans and the Dominicans coming and leaving this country. So it's become a highly politicized issue. And America has managed its migration policy very well. They have the top brains from all over the world in the science and technology in the universities, and they have the manual labor on the farms and the restaurants being run by the Latinos and by the Central Americans. If they continue to do this, you still have a very dynamic and vibrant Europe. Look at Japan. They are declining by 0.7% every year. And 2 working individuals have to work in order to support 1 retiree. That's not a sustainable situation at all, because Japan has a closed migration policy. So sooner or later, they have to open up their migration policy. So that is the compulsion which they have to face, and I hope that good sense will prevail upon them.
Dr. Sir, thank you very much. We have several hands that are up, so if I can request our panelists to probably stay back for a while and take those questions bilaterally, because I'm being prompted by the organizers that the next session will soon be started. I must thank the participants, because in the morning when I came to this room, of course, we thought that the interest in the topic wasn't probably there, but now with almost a half-full audience, it's really encouraging to see the interest. I also see a lot of people from the academia here, and let me assure you that this book from Dr. Ishrat Husain will continue to remain a key text in applied development economics, so do pick it up, And if I can at the same time request Dr. Ishrat to please initiate a blog around this book, so that those who cannot those questions which couldn't be catered over here, people could post those questions, comments on your book's blog. And finally, let me thank the Oxford University Press and their entire team for hosting us for this excellent session and this excellent and great event, So thank you very much, and a round of applause for our panelists, please.